Too long of an absence. I've missed you. I've thought about you and prayed about you for this whole last month, but I've really missed being with you. So I'm glad to be back with you, and I'm glad that Nikki's able to be with me this time, and that's great. The other reason I'm really happy to be with you is that this is not Michigan. We got in the car yesterday morning to head to the airport. The temperature gauge in my car said 10 degrees. And if that wasn't bad enough, then there's the minus in front of that. So I'm so happy to be here. This is great, but we go back tonight. So, oh well. Several years ago, I was talking to some high school kids in my congregation, and they were talking about all their friends who were heading off to Cancun, Mexico for spring break. And I said something about, I said, wow, you know, there's so much bad stuff that goes on down there they could get into. And one of the kids says, yeah, but you know, there's a phrase that goes around that the kids share among themselves. They say, what happens in Cancun stays in Cancun. And when I heard that, I thought, you know, that is a lie of Satan that is so bald-faced and so ridiculous that only an immature kid would be sucked in by that one. I mean, after all, come on. Does anyone with any intelligence actually believe that an STD contracted in Cancun is going to stay in Cancun? Does anyone believe that the people who make those Girls Gone Wild videos are only going to market those in Cancun afterwards? Does anyone believe that a relationship that has been destroyed in a drunken stupor in Cancun is going to be magically healed when the planes lift off from the Cancun airport? I thought, how ridiculous. Who would even believe that? And so it was with amazement a couple of years later when I saw an ad on TV from a tourism bureau that had taken that phrase and applied it to another city. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And I found out later that that campaign has been the most effective tourism campaign ever in the history of Las Vegas, which led me to believe that evidently there are people who believe, or at least who want to believe, that there is a place where you can go and you can violate all boundaries of responsible and decent behavior and somehow leave all the consequences behind when you come home. But regardless of what people believe, it doesn't change the fact that this is a lie straight from the depths of hell. The reality is that our actions, our public actions, but even our private and secret actions, have consequences for ourselves, for our families, and for our communities. Now, the last few times I've been here, I've been speaking from the book of Numbers, which is that book that in Hebrew is called In the Wilderness. It's a guidebook to talk to us about how do we navigate the transition times in our lives, and particularly how do God's people as a gathered community navigate transition times in their lives. And the book of Numbers makes a big point of the consequences, the public consequences of private wrongdoing. Chapter 5 of Numbers is devoted to the idea that the community is intended to be pure. And it gives 3 examples of impurity and the consequences of each. And the first one is very easy for us to understand. The Lord said to Moses, command the Israelites to send away from the camp anyone who has an infectious skin disease or a discharge of any kind, or who is ceremonially unclean because of a dead body. Send away male and female alike, send them outside the camp so they will not defile their camp where I dwell among them. The Israelites did this. They sent them outside the camp. They did this just as the Lord had instructed Moses. And we understand that the impurity that's talked about here is the danger from an infectious disease. And of course, we understand that quite clearly, and we try to keep ourselves away from. In fact, just this morning before Bible class, there was some discussion about how many people have the flu, and several people saying, I'm staying away from them because I want to catch that too, and we understand that. I remember several years ago when my grandson was, I think he was about 4, went down to visit him, and we went to one of these indoor play facilities, and he was playing around, and there was another group that came in, 2 moms and their 2 daughters, 2 little daughters, and they were getting all set up to go and play, and Anderson, who's a very outgoing young man, started approaching them. He thought, hey, friends, I got friends I can play with, and he got about 5 feet away from the table where they were sitting, and he let loose with the biggest, nastiest, juiciest sneeze that you have ever heard in your life. And these 2 moms, you know, they looked like, oh my goodness. And Anderson looked right at them and says, I'm really sick. Well, I very quickly intervened and explained to them, no, he's not, he doesn't have anything contagious. He's got allergies. And Anderson, make sure you cover your mouth when you do that, and so on. But in retrospect, I wish that I'd handled that differently. I wish that I'd gone up to the 2 moms with a sad face and said, yes, he is very ill, but don't worry. He got that in Vegas, so there's nothing to worry about. Well, we understand the danger that's posed by infectious diseases. And if you get that concept, then you're ready for the next 2 kinds of impurity that are talked about in Numbers chapter 5. These are infections that can cause great damage to the community. In fact, they can be more damaging than an uncontained outbreak of Ebola. The next one we find in chapter 5, verse 5, the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, when a man or woman wrongs another in any way, and so is unfaithful to the Lord, that person is guilty, and must confess the sin he has committed. He must make full restitution for his wrong, add 1/5 to it, and give it all to the person he has wronged. The impurity that is being talked about here is that of wronging others or harming them through dishonesty or through cheating. And we understand that that's important. How we treat each other is not just a private matter. It affects the whole community. And so the advice here is that if you do this, you can't just let it slide. You have to make it right. And the reality is that we are a community. We belong to one another. And how we treat each other matters. It makes a difference in the quality of the life that we share with each other. We belong to each other. So if we cheat each other financially, the consequences affect the whole community. If we wrong one another through idle talk or gossip or slander, or even through unwise or unguarded comments on social media, if we do something to harm each other's reputation, that's not a private matter. It's a community concern. And we need to make it right, or it will damage the whole community. And that's a point that's echoed by Jesus in Matthew chapter 5. He says, therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Jesus says, whenever we become aware that we have harmed another person through our actions, it's not a matter of just, oh, don't worry about it, let it slide, to err is human, we're going to be okay. Jesus says, no, go and make that right before you come to the table, before you come into a fellowship where we are united with one another and proclaiming ourselves as members of the body of Christ. Before you do that, make it right. Don't do that until you've addressed that wrong. Now, if we understand that, that leads us to the final example in Numbers chapter 5, which I will tell you, this last example is a strange little section of Scripture. So hang with me. It starts out innocently enough. Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man's wife goes astray and is unfaithful to him by sleeping with another man, and this is hidden from her husband, and her impurity is undetected, since there is no witness against her and she has not been caught in the act, and if feelings of jealousy come over her husband and he suspects his wife and she is impure, or if he is jealous and suspects her even though she is not impure, then he is to take his wife to the priest. He must also take a reminder offering to draw attention to guilt. Now the danger here is either the suspicion of or the reality of marital infidelity. A husband suspects that his wife is being unfaithful to him, and we can easily understand how that could be harmful. If he suspects his wife and she is in fact being unfaithful, that has a devastating impact on the marriage and on the family, but it also has ripple effects throughout the whole community. It causes the quality of the whole community's life to be degraded. But what if a man suspects his wife of unfaithfulness and she's not guilty? The very fact that he harbors those suspicions is a harm to her. It's a harm to the marriage, and even that can have negative effects throughout the whole community. And so the instruction here is, get it taken care of, address it. If a man suspects that his wife is unfaithful, take her to the priest and allow the priest to determine whether this is indeed happening or not. Now, this is where the passage gets weird. I'm not going to read it word for word. Let me just paraphrase. Because the procedure for determining whether this spouse was guilty of adultery or not was this. The priest was to take holy water from before the altar, and he was to sweep up some dust from the floor of the tabernacle and mix that in with that holy water. Then he was to take a parchment scroll, and on that scroll he was to write down all of the curses that were applied to a person who was guilty of adultery. Then he was to wash the ink off that parchment into that water that already has the dust from the tabernacle floor on it, mix it up real good, and give it to this woman who is suspected of adultery, give it to her to drink. And if after drinking that concoction, if she came down with a horrible disease, a wasting disease, and her abdomen swelled to several times its normal size, then they knew that she was guilty and she would bear the punishment of having committed adultery against her husband. If she was not guilty, there would be no ill effects, and basically the priest would tell her husband, get over it, go home, and stop suspecting your wife of things that she hasn't done. Now, that's weird, isn't it? And it leaves us with the obvious question, well, did that work? Did it work? And my answer to that is very simple. If this book is inspired by God, then by faith, I accept the fact that, yes, it worked. But I also look at it and say, how in the world could that possibly work? And again, because now you take some water and you mix some dust into it and then wash some ink into it, that's probably not going to taste very good, and it might give you a little bit of a stomach ache, but to cause disease at the normal size, that physical symptoms